The afternoon sun beat down on Officer James Whittaker's patrol car as he cruised through the tree-lined streets of Oakwood Heights. 15 years on the force had left him with deep frown lines around his mouth and a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas. Today was just like any other day, watching over the wealthiest neighborhood in Springfield, making sure everything stayed just the way the rich folks liked it. He took a slow sip of his lukewarm coffee and grimaced. The radio crackled with routine chatter, but nothing that required his attention. That's when he spotted it, a sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows gliding down Maple Avenue. Something about it just didn't sit right with him. Too nice for this part of town, he muttered to himself, even though Oakwood Heights was filled with luxury cars. But this one felt different to him. He didn't bother waiting for a traffic violation. People like him never needed a real reason. With a flick of his wrist, he turned on his flashing lights and pulled out behind the Mercedes. The car immediately signaled and pulled over smoothly to the side of the road. Whittaker noticed how perfectly it was parked, straight and proper, not rushed or panicked like when people have something to hide. Still, he had his suspicions. He radioed in the license plate and waited. The system came back clean. The car was registered to an A. Johnson. No flags, no warnings, nothing unusual at all. Probably borrowed it, he thought, already creating a story in his mind about how this driver couldn't possibly own such an expensive vehicle legitimately. Officer Whittaker adjusted his belt, making sure his holster was easily accessible. It was a habit he developed over the years, especially when approaching certain types of drivers. He didn't like to admit, even to himself, that he treated some people differently than others. He stepped out of his patrol car, sunglasses firmly in place, despite the shadows cast by the giant oak trees lining the street. A few neighbors had paused their gardening to watch. Mrs. Henderson across the street had stopped watering her prized roses, and old Mr. Thompson had frozen mid-stride while walking his tiny yapping dog. Whittaker approached with measured steps, watching the driver through the tinted windows. He couldn't make out much, just the outline of someone sitting perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel. At least they knew that much about dealing with police. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman, a black woman. Something in his expression hardened, though he would have denied it if anyone pointed it out. He rapped on the window with his knuckles, harder than necessary. The window slid down smoothly, revealing a tired-looking woman in her 40s. She was wearing what looked like expensive clothes, but what caught his eye was the hospital ID badge hanging around her neck. "License and registration," he said flatly, without bothering to introduce himself or explain why he'd pulled her over. The woman looked confused but remained composed. "Of course, officer. May I ask when I'm being stopped?" "I don't believe I was speeding or breaking any traffic laws." Her voice was cultured and confident, the kind of voice that was used to being listened to. It irritated him immediately. "License and registration first," he repeated, more firmly this time. "Then we can discuss why I pulled you over." She nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact for just a moment longer than he found comfortable. "I'm going to reach into my purse for my wallet now," she said clearly, narrating her movements. Officer Whittaker watched her carefully as she produced a genuine leather wallet. Everything about her seemed expensive: the car, the clothes, the accessories. It didn't fit the picture he'd created in his mind, but he wasn't ready to let go of his suspicions. As she handed over her license and the car's registration, he glanced at the name, Dr. Amara Johnson. He looked from the ID to her face and back again, his expression giving nothing away. Little did he know, this routine stop was about to become anything but routine. And by the end of this encounter, Officer James Whittaker would wish he'd never flipped those patrol lights on in the first place. Dr. Amara Johnson's day had been the kind that tested every limit she had. 14 hours in the operating room, standing until her feet went numb, focusing so intensely that her eyes burned. But she'd done it. The little boy with the brain tumor that everyone else had deemed inoperable was now recovering in the ICU, his prognosis better than anyone had dared hope. She had finally allowed herself to feel the bone-deep exhaustion as she slid into her car in the hospital parking garage. The leather seats of her Mercedes embraced her like an old friend. This car had been her first big purchase after becoming head of neurosurgery. A reminder that the little girl from the east side could study by candlelight when the electricity got cut off had made something of herself. Amara had just wanted to get home, kick off her shoes, pour a glass of wine, and call her mother to tell her about the successful surgery. Instead, here she was, pulled over for no apparent reason, looking at a police officer whose face might as well have been carved from stone. Dr. Amara Johnson, Officer Whitaker read from her license, a note of surprise in his voice that he quickly masked. He studied the photo, then her face, then back to the photo, as if he couldn't quite reconcile the two. "Yes, that's me," Amara said calmly, though she could feel her heart beginning to race. She'd been here before, not with this particular officer, but with this particular situation. "Officer, I'd really appreciate knowing why I've been stopped." Whitaker handed back her license but kept the registration. "This is a very expensive vehicle, Dr. Johnson." The way he said doctor made it sound like he didn't believe it was a real title. "Yes, it is," she replied evenly. "I worked hard for it." "And you're driving through Oakwood Heights because—" Amara took a slow, measured breath. The hospital ID badge still hung around her neck, her name and title clearly visible beneath the Springfield Memorial Hospital logo. Her scrubs were partially visible under her open coat. There was even a surgical cap pushed into her coat pocket, forgotten in her exhaustion. "I'm driving through Oakwood Heights because it's on my way home from the hospital," she explained, gesturing toward her ID. "I just finished a 14-hour shift performing brain surgery. I'm very tired, officer, and I'd like to get home if there's no actual reason I've been pulled over." Something flickered across Whitaker's face, irritation, perhaps, at her composed response. He tapped her registration against his palm. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area. High-end vehicles like this one." Amara's patience began to fray at the edges. "My car hasn't been stolen, officer. I'm driving it. It's registered to me, as you can see from the paperwork in your hand." "How long have you owned this vehicle?" he pressed. 3 years, she answered, then added, "I can show you the purchase receipt if you'd like. I keep it in the glove compartment along with all my maintenance records." A car drove past slowly, the driver obviously curious about the police stop. Amara recognized him as one of her patients from last year, a middle-aged white man who'd had a benign tumor removed. He didn't seem to recognize her from this distance. Officer Whitaker noticed the passing car too, and something in his demeanor shifted slightly. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, Dr. Johnson." The way he emphasized her title again made her skin prickle with unease. "May I ask why?" Her voice remained steady, but her mind was racing. This was escalating in a way that was all too familiar and all too dangerous. "I need to verify that this vehicle belongs to you. Please step out of the car." Amara's hand moved slowly toward her phone sitting in the center console. "I don't believe that's necessary, officer. I've provided my license and registration, both of which confirm my ownership of this vehicle." Whitaker's posture stiffened. "Ma'am, I'm not asking. I'm telling you to exit the vehicle now." Amara's fingers closed around her phone, and she made a decision. Keeping her movements deliberate and visible, she picked up her phone. "I'm going to call my attorney now, Officer Whitaker," she said, reading his nameplate for the first time. "And I'm going to start recording this interaction. I believe we both deserve to have this conversation documented properly." The officer's face darkened like a thundercloud. The phone's camera light turned on with a small beep, and Officer Whitaker's nostrils flared. His hand moved to rest on his belt, uncomfortably close to his holster. "Put the phone down. Now." His voice had dropped an octave, carrying that dangerous edge that made Amara's stomach tighten. But Dr. Johnson had not come this far in life by backing down when she knew she was right. She held the phone steady, making sure it captured both her face and the officer standing outside her window. "I'm well within my rights to record this interaction, Officer Whitaker," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Now, can you please explain why you're asking me to exit my vehicle when I've provided all the required documentation?" A bead of sweat trickled down Whitaker's temple despite the cool evening air. "I have reason to believe this vehicle may be stolen, and I need to conduct a search." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Based on what evidence exactly?" "The registration matches my license. The car is in perfect condition. I've broken no traffic laws. So what exactly is your probable cause, officer?" Another car slowed as it passed, this one a red pickup truck. The driver, an older man with white hair, stared openly at the scene before continuing down the street. "Step out of the car, Dr. Johnson," Whitaker repeated, his jaw clenched so tight that a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Amara knew what difficult meant in this context. She'd heard the stories too many times to count. But she also knew her rights, and she wasn't about to let fear override them. "I'm going to call my attorney now," she said, her thumb already scrolling through her contacts. She pressed the name Thomas Chen, legal, and put the phone on speaker while keeping the camera recording. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "Amara? Everything okay? It's pretty late." "Tom, I've been pulled over on Maple Avenue in Oakwood Heights. The officer has asked me to exit my vehicle to conduct a search. He claims he suspects my car is stolen, despite my having provided license and registration proving otherwise. I'm recording this interaction, but I wanted legal counsel present." Officer Whitaker's face flushed red. He took a step back from the car, clearly not having expected her to have an attorney on speed dial. "This is Thomas Chen, attorney at law," the voice on the speaker said, suddenly much more formal. "Who am I speaking with, officer?" "This doesn't concern you," Whitaker said sharply. "Your client needs to comply with." "My client," Tom interrupted, "has already complied by providing her license and registration. Unless you have specific, articulable facts that would constitute probable cause for a search, you are overstepping your authority, officer." "Whitaker," Amara supplied. "Badge number 4572. "Officer Whitaker," Tom continued. "Now, would you mind sharing with me the specific reason for this stop and subsequent search request?" The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Amara could see Whitaker weighing his options, the realization dawning that this wasn't going to be the easy intimidation he might have expected. Just then, the sound of another police siren wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. "Backup?" Tom asked through the phone. "Did you call for backup for a routine traffic stop, Officer Whitaker?" Whitaker's eyes darted to his patrol car, then back to Amara. "Wait here," he ordered, then strode back to his vehicle. Through her rearview mirror, Amara watched as he spoke into his radio, gesturing angrily. The approaching police car turned onto Maple Avenue, its lights flashing but siren now silent. A few more neighbors had come outside, standing on their perfectly manicured lawns to watch the scene unfold. One woman in a floral bathrobe was recording with her phone. Another man, walking his dog, had stopped completely and was frowning at the two police cars. "Tom, there's another officer arriving," Amara said into the phone, keeping her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. "Stay calm and keep recording," Tom advised. "Don't exit the vehicle unless they present a warrant or specific legal cause. I'm on my way. Should be there in about 15 minutes." The second patrol car pulled up behind Whitaker's, and Amara watched as a younger officer stepped out. Even from this distance, she could see that his demeanor was different, less aggressive, more alert, and curious. As he approached Officer Whitaker, something unexpected happened. The young officer's eyes widened in recognition as he glanced toward Amara's car. And for the first time since being pulled over, she felt a flicker of hope. The younger officer approached with purpose in his step. Officer Whitaker turned to him with an expression that clearly said he didn't appreciate the interruption. "I've got this handled, Rodriguez," Whitaker said, his voice carrying through the evening air. Officer Rodriguez glanced between Whitaker and the Mercedes, his eyes lingering on Dr. Johnson. A flash of recognition crossed his face, followed by visible confusion about the situation. "Dr. Johnson," he called out, moving past Whitaker toward her car. Amara's shoulders relaxed slightly at being addressed by her proper title. "Yes, Officer Rodriguez," she confirmed, though she couldn't immediately place how he knew her. Whitaker stiffened. "You know this woman?" Rodriguez nodded slowly, his expression serious. "Sir, that's Dr. Amara Johnson. She performed emergency surgery on my mother last year after her aneurysm. Saved her life when 3 other doctors said it couldn't be done." He turned back to Amara. "My mother still bakes you those pumpkin muffins around Christmas, Dr. Johnson. Elena Rodriguez." The connection clicked in Amara's mind. "Elena? Of course. How is she doing?" "Still keeping up with her physical therapy." "Doing great thanks to you," Rodriguez said with genuine warmth before his face turned professional again. He looked at Whittaker. "What seems to be the issue here, sir?" By now, the crowd of onlookers had grown. A silver-haired woman in an expensive tracksuit marched across the street toward them, phone in hand. Amara recognized her immediately as Councilwoman Patricia Reynolds, head of the city's Public Safety Committee. "Officers," the councilwoman called out as she approached. "What exactly is happening here?" Whittaker's face paled slightly. "Ma'am, this is police business. I'm going to have to ask you to." "I'm Councilwoman Reynolds," she interrupted, "and I live right across the street. I've been watching this situation unfold for the past 10 minutes, and I'd very much like to know why one of our city's most respected doctors is being treated like a criminal on my street." The attorney's voice came through the speaker of Amara's phone. "Councilwoman Reynolds, this is Thomas Chen, Dr. Johnson's attorney. Thank you for being a witness to this incident." Rodriguez looked increasingly uncomfortable as he glanced between his superior officer, the councilwoman, and Dr. Johnson. "Sir," he said quietly to Whittaker, "maybe we should." "I haven't done anything wrong," Whittaker snapped, though his confidence was clearly wavering. "I had reason to believe." "What reason?" Councilwoman Reynolds pressed, her phone still recording. "Because I've been watching, and I haven't seen Dr. Johnson do anything except comply with your requests while asserting her rights." More neighbors had gathered now, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. A young couple with their child, an elderly man leaning on his cane, a jogger who had stopped mid-run, all watching with various expressions of concern and curiosity. Officer Rodriguez made a decision. He stepped closer to Dr. Johnson's window, respectfully keeping his hands visible. "Dr. Johnson, I apologize for the inconvenience. Could you tell me your understanding of why you were pulled over today?" Amara appreciated his professional tone. "I have no idea, Officer Rodriguez. I was driving home from a long shift at the hospital when Officer Whittaker pulled me over. I provided my license and registration as requested. When I asked why I was stopped, he suggested my car might be stolen, despite the registration matching my ID. Then he ordered me to exit the vehicle so he could search it, without providing any legal basis." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Whittaker. "Sir, what was the traffic violation or probable cause for the initial stop?" The question hung in the air. Everyone, the councilwoman, the neighbors, even passing cars that had slowed to rubberneck, seemed to be waiting for Whittaker's response. His jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed. The vehicle matched a description in a bulletin. "Which bulletin?" Rodriguez asked. "I don't recall any alerts about black Mercedes sedans today." Councilwoman Reynolds stepped closer. "I'd very much like to see this bulletin as well, Officer Whittaker." A bead of sweat trickled down Whittaker's temple as he realized the hole he'd dug himself into was getting deeper by the second. His eyes darted from face to face in the growing crowd, finding no allies. Officer Rodriguez turned back to Amara, his decision made. "Dr. Johnson, unless Officer Whittaker can provide specific cause for further detention, you're free to go. I apologize for the inconvenience to you after what I'm sure was a long day saving lives." The relief that washed over Amara was palpable, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Officer Whittaker's face had turned an uncomfortable shade of red as he stood rooted to the spot. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 20 people, all watching the scene unfold with the kind of interest reserved for live theater. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, but his words carried little conviction now. Councilwoman Reynolds stepped closer, her phone still recording. "And what exactly was that job tonight, Officer Whittaker?" "Harassing one of our city's finest physicians after she finished saving lives." Amara took a deep breath, centering herself. Through her open window, she addressed Officer Rodriguez directly. "I appreciate your intervention, but I'd like to understand why this happened in the first place." She glanced at Whittaker. "This isn't about me personally. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to someone else who might not have an attorney on speed dial or the good fortune to be recognized." Officer Rodriguez nodded respectfully. "I understand, Dr. Johnson." "Dr. Johnson." A new voice called from the gathering crowd. A middle-aged woman pushed her way forward, recognition lighting her face. "Oh my goodness, it is you." Amara squinted slightly in the fading light. "Mrs. Clark." The woman turned to the crowd, gesturing excitedly. "This woman saved my daughter's life last month. Brain tumor the size of a golf ball, and Dr. Johnson removed it without damaging a single important bit. My Lily is back in school now, good as new." Someone in the crowd started clapping, and soon several others joined in. Whitaker looked as if he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Not only that, Councilwoman Reynolds added loudly, "Dr. Johnson chairs our hospital board and was just appointed to the mayor's healthcare committee last week." There was a whole write-up in the Springfield Gazette. Officer Rodriguez turned to his colleague, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and disappointment. "Sir, maybe we should." "Wait," called another voice. A tall man in a jogging suit stepped forward. "Aren't you the same officer who pulled over my son last month? Hispanic kid, honor student, driving his graduation present? You made him sit on the curb for 45 minutes while you searched his car." Whitaker's eyes darted around as more murmurs rippled through the crowd. "And my nephew," added an elderly woman. "You ticketed him for a broken taillight that wasn't even broken." The attorney's voice came through Amara's phone speaker. "I'm documenting all of this, Dr. Johnson. I'll be at your location in 3 minutes." Amara watched as Officer Whitaker's demeanor transformed completely. His shoulders slumped, and the aggressive confidence drained from his posture. For the first time, he looked directly at her without suspicion. Instead, there was dawning horror in his eyes as he realized not only who she was, but the very public mess he had created. "Dr. Johnson," he began, his voice suddenly softer, almost pleading. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "Is that what we're calling it now?" Councilwoman Reynolds cut in. "A misunderstanding." Officer Rodriguez stepped in diplomatically. "Ma'am, if I could just—" The sound of another car pulling up interrupted him. A sleek black sedan parked across the street, and a man in a crisp suit emerged, carrying a leather briefcase. "That's my attorney," Amara said, finally putting her phone down, but making sure it was still recording. Thomas Chen crossed the street with purpose, nodding to the councilwoman who he clearly knew. "Tom," the councilwoman greeted him. "Quite a situation we have here." "Indeed," he replied, then turned to Amara. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, then looked meaningfully at the gathered crowd. "But I'm concerned about a pattern of behavior that seems to be affecting our community." Whitaker attempted to regain some control of the situation. "Look, Dr. Johnson, I apologize if there was a misunderstanding, but I was just following protocol." "Which protocol is that?" Thomas asked sharply. "The one where you pull over black drivers in luxury cars without cause? Because I'd very much like to see that written down somewhere." The silence that followed was deafening. Whitaker opened his mouth, then closed it again. Every word he considered felt like it would only dig his hole deeper. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "Dr. Johnson, you're free to go. Officer Whitaker and I will be having a conversation with our captain about this incident." He turned to Whitaker. "Sir, I believe we should return to the station immediately." As darkness settled over Oakwood Heights, the street lamps flickered on, casting everyone in a harsh, revealing light. In that moment, with all eyes upon him, Officer James Whitaker finally saw himself clearly too, and he didn't like what he saw. By morning, everyone in Springfield seemed to know what had happened on Maple Avenue. Video clips circulated rapidly across local social media groups, text messages flew between friends and neighbors, and the Springfield Gazette had already posted an online article with the headline, "Respected neurosurgeon racially profiled in affluent neighborhood." Dr. Amara Johnson sat in her kitchen, a cup of tea growing cold between her hands as she scrolled through the flood of messages on her phone. Colleagues from the hospital expressing outrage, former patients offering support. Even Mayor Wilson had left a voicemail personally apologizing for her experience. Her attorney Thomas had already filed a formal complaint with the police department and was discussing the possibility of a civil rights lawsuit. But Amara wasn't sure that was the right approach. Surgery had taught her that sometimes the most direct path wasn't necessarily the most effective one for healing. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Councilwoman Reynolds standing on her porch, holding a folder and looking determined. "I hope I'm not intruding," the councilwoman said when Amara opened the door. "But I thought you might want to see this." Inside the folder were printed copies of civilian complaints filed against Officer Whitaker over the past 5 years. 15 in total, 13 from people of color, all dismissed due to insufficient evidence or officer's discretionary authority. The police chief called an emergency meeting this morning, Reynolds explained, settling onto Amara's couch. Your incident was the main topic. Whitaker's been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Amara flipped through the complaints, her heart heavy. These people didn't have videos. They didn't have witnesses. They didn't have an attorney on the phone. They just had their word against his. Exactly, Reynolds said. Which is why your case matters so much. You have what they didn't. Amara's phone buzzed with a news alert. The local TV station was running the story as their lead, showing clips from multiple angles. The reporter stood outside police headquarters where a small group of protesters had already gathered, some holding signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Racial Profiling." They want to interview you, Reynolds said. The news station, I mean. They've been calling my office all morning trying to reach you. Amara set down her phone. What good would that do? Turn this into a media circus. It would keep the pressure on, Reynolds replied. But that's not why I'm here. I have a different idea. Later that afternoon, Amara stood in the wood-paneled conference room at police headquarters. Seated around the large table were Police Chief Donovan, 3 police captains, Councilwoman Reynolds, the mayor's chief of staff, and 2 community organizers from neighborhoods that had reported the highest rates of problematic police stops. Conspicuously absent was Officer Whitaker himself, who had reportedly called in sick after videos of the incident had gone viral locally. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Chief Donovan began, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform. His eyes kept darting to the stack of complaint forms that Reynolds had placed prominently in the center of the table. We're here to discuss the unfortunate incident involving Dr. Johnson and, if I may, Amara interrupted gently. I'd prefer not to focus solely on my experience. What happened to me last night happens to people across this city every day. The difference is, I had resources and recognition that protected me. The room fell silent as she continued. I'm not interested in punishing one officer. I'm interested in changing a system that allowed this to happen 15 times that we know of. She gestured to the complaint forms. These incidents aren't isolated. They're symptoms. One of the community organizers, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, nodded in agreement. We've been saying this for years. The police captains shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Chief Donovan leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Johnson? A complete overhaul of how complaints are handled. Independent review. Mandatory body cameras with penalties for turning them off. Community oversight that includes people from the neighborhoods most affected. Amara's voice was calm but firm. And I'd like to help implement these changes. The chief's eyebrows rose. You want to work with the police department? I'm a surgeon, Amara replied with a small smile. My job is to fix broken systems, not just treat symptoms. And right now, this system needs more than a band-aid. As the meeting continued into the evening, no one noticed the figure watching through the glass door, Officer Rodriguez, listening intently to every word, realizing that what had started as a routine patrol shift for his colleague might end up changing the entire department forever. 6 months had passed since that night on Maple Avenue. The Springfield Police Department looked the same from the outside. Same brick building, same flag waving out front, same blue uniforms coming and going through the glass doors. But inside, everything had changed. Officer James Whitaker sat alone in the community center of the Pine Hills neighborhood, a predominantly black area he'd rarely visited before except on calls. He checked his watch nervously. The community meeting would start in 15 minutes, and his palms were already sweating. The door opened, and he looked up, half expecting to see angry faces. Instead, it was Officer Rodriguez. Didn't think you'd actually come, Rodriguez said, taking a seat next to him. Whitaker shrugged. Wasn't my choice, remember? Part of the agreement. After a lengthy investigation, Whitaker had been given a choice: resign or complete the department's new reform program, which included diversity training, community service, and public accountability sessions. To everyone's surprise, including his own, he'd chosen the latter. The first month had been pure hell. facing the evidence of his biased behavior, watching the videos of himself through others' eyes, listening to testimony from people he'd pulled over without cause. He'd fought it at first, making excuses, blaming the system, claiming he was being made a scapegoat. Then came the session with Dr. Johnson herself. She'd agreed to meet with him as part of the program, bringing not anger but something far more devastating, honest questions about why he'd done what he did. "They're ready for you," Rodriguez said, nodding toward the meeting room where people were filing in. "You good?" Whitaker straightened his tie. He wasn't in uniform today. "No. But that's the point, isn't it?" Inside, about 30 community members sat in folding chairs. Some faces were openly hostile, others curious, a few even sympathetic. At the front of the room stood Dr. Amara Johnson, now head of the newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee, and beside her, Chief Donovan, who'd surprised everyone by embracing the reforms rather than fighting them. "Thank you all for coming," Amara began. "As you know, these monthly meetings are part of our new transparency initiative. Tonight, Officer Whitaker has asked to address the community directly." The room fell silent as Whitaker walked to the front. Looking out at the faces watching him, he realized he'd spent 15 years seeing some of these people as suspects rather than citizens. The thought made him deeply uncomfortable, which he now recognized was exactly how he needed to feel. 6 months ago, he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I pulled over Dr. Johnson for no legitimate reason. I want to start by saying what I should have said then. I was wrong." He paused, gathering himself. "I've spent these months looking back at my record, at how many cars I stopped based on who I thought might be inside rather than what they actually did, at how differently I spoke to different people based on assumptions I made about them." A few people nodded. One older woman in the front row watched him with narrowed eyes, clearly remembering her own experience. "I can't undo those actions," Whitaker continued, "but I can tell you that I'm working every day to be better. And more importantly, I'm working to help make sure other officers don't follow the same path." He explained the new training program he was helping to develop for the department, how traffic stop data was now being tracked by race and neighborhood, how every officer now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters, how complaints were now reviewed by a board that included community members. After the meeting, as people filed out, some stopped to speak with him. Not everyone, many simply walked past with lingering distrust. But a few engaged, asking tough questions, sharing experiences, testing whether his transformation was genuine. Dr. Johnson waited until the room had emptied before approaching him. "That couldn't have been easy," she said. Whitaker shook his head. "Nothing about this has been easy. But necessary? Absolutely." She studied him for a moment. "You know, in surgery, I often tell my residents that healing is painful. The body resists change, fights against the very interventions designed to save it." "And does it work?" "The healing?" he asked. "Not always," she admitted. "But when it does, the transformation can be remarkable." She gestured around the community center. 6 months ago, you wouldn't have set foot in this neighborhood voluntarily. Now you're helping build bridges here." Outside, the sun was setting over Springfield. Across town, Officer Rodriguez was leading a training session for new recruits, teaching them what he'd learned. At City Hall, Councilwoman Reynolds was reviewing data from the first months of the reform program, noting the sharp decline in questionable stops. And on Maple Avenue, where it all began, cars of all makes and models driven by people of all backgrounds moved freely through the twilight, without fear of being stopped for simply existing in the wrong place, in the wrong skin.